Good evening, and welcome back to Sitting Down a Snowy Laneway podcast. Today's episode is about... Turn the lights off. Today's episode is about... Ghost Extra. Okay, so this is like the first episode of my podcast, even though it's on YouTube. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could find an MP3 converter and then put it on your old school iPod, or burn it to a disc for your Discman, or hold up an old cassette player and record it on your cassette for your Walkman. I don't know what your kids do these days. Or you could just listen to it now. I listen to podcasts all the time, and because of the terrible passage of time, I'm worried about wrinkles and losing my hair. So this way, I can just be young forever with my voice. Unless, of course, my voice is in a terrible car accident and I lose that completely. Hadn't thought about that. Well, I'm going to look twice before crossing the road from now on. Why only twice is it you look before crossing the road? Anyway, back to Ghost Extra. One of my day jobs is being a film, TV and commercial extra. Here's proof for those of you still watching this with your eyes. This is me in Home and Away, an old Aussie soap opera about teenagers by the beach. This is me in the fictional town of Summer Bay, in a cafe, wearing a Hawaiian shirt that's grossly too big for me. Here's how I found the shirt in my dressing room. I guess they're going to make fun of me wearing it. I've been an extra on Home and Away since I was a teenager. There's young Sean now. To be young again. Film and TV is like time travel. It's a new phenomenon. It's amazing to see yourself young and in colour and moving around. It really is possible to document your whole life now. I wonder how more advanced the technology would be as we go even more into the future. Of course, older and wiser, I wouldn't want to go back. But for a day it would be fun. It's fun being an extra. It's the best role on set. I often look around and look at the grips and the lighting guys. They do a lot of hard work, a lot of heavy lifting, and it's pretty much just construction work. They might as well be on a construction site for a new house. And the best job in the world is watching other people work. So that's what extras do, just sit around all day, and eventually they call you over to set, and you just have to stand there or sit there. I often do this thing where I look up at the ceiling and I pretend my character has realized he's on a set. I'm like, hey, where'd that roof go? No ceilings? This is weird. Only 3 walls to this place? Anyway, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, extras. I've been in a lot of other things too. Maybe I'll talk about it if this podcast lasts more than 2 episodes. But ghost extras are a new phenomenon because extras have only been around for 100 years, because that is the length of the Hollywood industry, I think. Were they making stuff in the 1800s? I should have done research for this. But the most famous ghost extra would be the ghost boy seen for a brief second in 3 Men and a Baby, directed by Leonard Nimoy, I think, and starring Ted Danson from Getting Even with Dad. There's a ghost boy as the camera pans left, just standing in the curtains. It's unsettling because the grandmother and the baby and Ted Danson are all smiling and happy, and you just see this thing in the background just peering. But Snoops tells me it's just a cardboard cutout of Ted Danson himself wearing a top hat. But that doesn't look like it to me. But then again, ghosts aren't real, so I guess it's a cardboard cutout. Or are they? There's an author, an Aussie author I love, called John Pinkney, I'll probably be reciting a lot of his books during these podcasts. They're my favourite kind of reading material if I'm stuck on a train or something. One of John Pinkney's books is called Unexplained, about disappearances, hauntings, and omens. There's a page about an uncanny extra invades a movie set. This seems a much more plausible story than the Ted Danson Ghost Boy one, but I'll let you decide. Now I'm just going to be reciting this. Hopefully I don't get sued for copyright infringement. In 1972, 7 years before they filmed the internationally successful road movie Mad Max, I think it was just called Road Warrior, and it was America that called it Mad Max? Or maybe I've got it back to front. Anyway, in 1972, 7 years before they filmed the internationally successful road movie Mad Max, young producers Byron Kennedy and George Miller were hard at work in Melbourne's sprawling General Cemetery. It was 7:30 on a sunny spring morning, and along with 9 actors and crew, they were recreating a 19th century burial scene for a short film they were earnestly hoping, budget permitting, to complete on time. While the cameras were rolling, a member of the cast took 2 still photographs. On one of them appeared the image of a hooded figure, as you can see there, which was apparently watching the proceedings from behind a tombstone. Doesn't that give you goosebumps? The picture, which would puzzle numerous photographers and filmmakers, taken by Russell O'Regan, who subsequently became an executive with the distribution company Filmways. Some particular information there. I snapped the Phantom, or whatever it was, at the time when George Miller and Byron Kennedy were starting out in the film business, Russell told me. Well, he didn't tell me, he told John Pinkney, I assume. They'd already made one brilliant short, Violence, in the cinema. For their second production, they decided to film a documentary, The Devil in Evening Dress. It was about Federici, the ghostly opera singer who reportedly haunts Melbourne's Princess Theatre. The doco had a pretty good cast. The late Frank Thring was the narrator. John Finlayson had a major part, page 2, and there were interviews with Michael Patt and June Bronhill, who'd both had brushes with the princess ghost. George and Byron asked me to play 2 tiny roles. In one, I was a stagehand who watched Federici crash through the stage trap door. In the other, I was a top-hatted mourner at the funeral. I decided to get some souvenir snaps, so I borrowed a camera from my friend Susan Fields in Channel 9's traffic department and took what I believed to be a couple of very ordinary shots. 2 nights later, Sue and I projected the developed slides. One showed the actors and nothing more, but when we screened the other one, taken only a second later, there, as clear as day, on the left of the shot, was this terrifying apparition. I rang George Miller to tell him, and he scoffed. He pointed out that he hadn't even tried to recreate the Phantom for his film. All he'd used were eerie angle shots and dry ice blowing around the stage. I arranged to meet George and Byron at the Village Roadshow office. George changed his attitude immediately. He and the village people and the critic Denbar Salter were all thunderstruck. Thunderstruck! AC/DC, or Akadaka. Great song. Thunderstruck. I digress. Byron and George were so intrigued that they went back to the cemetery at 7:30 the next morning to try to prove the Phantom was a trick of light and shadows. But no matter how many shots they took, from many angles, all they showed was a tombstone with a fence around it. George came back from the graveyard and said, "I'm buggered if I know what that thing on the photo is." Today, the Melbourne General Cemetery phantom remains an unexplained phenomenon. Well, isn't that great? They think it was the ghost of the Princess Theatre in Melbourne. I've rarely been to Melbourne, and even rarer, I've gone to the Princess Theatre, which is of course none at all. The next part of the book goes on to describe the Princess Theatre ghost. Might as well keep reading. Attacked by an entity with murder on its mind. For more than a century, frightened actors, stagehands, and patrons have been reporting eerie lights and uncanny noises in Melbourne's Baroque Princess Theatre. Among witnesses who had bizarre brushes with the phantom are veteran Australian TV performers Bert Newton and the late Colin McEwen. The two men encountered the entity while they were working at separate times on an upper floor of the theatre building. Bert Newton's experience with the princess ghost was a happy one. It probably saved his job. But Colin McEwen told a darker story. He was convinced the spirit tried to kill him and had similar sinister designs on his colleagues. While taking a tea break from taping a TV commercial, Colin described his waking nightmare to me. Well, not to me, to John Pinkney again, no doubt. It happened in the late 1950s when I was working as an all-night announcer with the radio station 3XY. The studios in those days were housed in the old Princess Theatre in Spring Street. We all had to work crammed in a corkscrew tangle of attic rooms. At about 2 o'clock one morning, I put on a clutch of records and commercials and stepped out onto the old rickety stairs for a breather. From where I stood, you could see down into the dark, empty stalls with the great stage looming behind. I'd leaned on the stair railing often enough before, but that night, for some reason, I felt uneasy. Then I knew why. Suddenly, something cold and strong grabbed my shoulder and shoved. For a moment, it seemed I'd go pitching down the stairs and break my neck, but I grabbed the rail like grim death. And then, what seemed like some kind of crazy ghost was gone. I talked to other members of 3XY's night staff. All said that had similar experiences. Several weeks later, an even more frightening event occurred. I was sitting in the studio with 2 other staff members when the engineer walked in with a flask of coffee. Without warning, something invisible, held him against the wall. Coffee and blood spluttered everywhere. I formed the opinion at that time, and didn't revise it much afterward, that something malevolent was at work in our station studios. Something that wanted us out of there, or dead. Wow, that sounds rather terrifying. I wonder if he'd only gone outside for a breather as he claimed, or maybe he was smoking some wacky tobacco. Now we move on to Bert Newton's encounter. Oh, it's entitled Bert Newton's Extraordinary Encounter. In 1955, the 16-year-old Bert Newton had the all-night announcing shift at the Princess Theatre-based radio station 3XY. Back then, there were so few commercials in the wee hours that I'd sometimes play both sides of an album without a break, he told me. Well, not me, but I'm sure John Pinkney. One very black morning, I put on the first side of a record, then, feeling lonely, wandered down to see the engineer, who was the only other person in the building. When I reached the control room, he was asleep. Not surprisingly, I suppose, as he was studying law during the day. I wandered around for a while, then panicked. I realized I'd been strolling for too long, and the needle was probably scratching around the record label. I rushed back upstairs, ready to apologize to the listeners. But then, to my amazement, I saw someone had turned the record over. The needle was in the first track, on the second side. He's referring to vinyl records to our younger listeners. A record is a round, groovy kind of musical playing device. Groovy in the sense that it isn't hip or cool, it is in fact grooved. with little lines. Anyway, I digress. Back to the story. Naturally, I thanked the engineer, but he denied having gone near the studio. The management confirmed to me next day that no one else had been in the building at that hour, and security, even in those times, was too tight for an intruder to have entered. I'm skeptical about ghosts, but I'm forced to admit that something very weird happened that night. Well, that was a nice encounter with the ghost. If it was the same hooded figure that we see here in the cemetery, and the same one that tries to knock people downstairs. Maybe it's a ghost of a different person, or maybe it is the prince's ghost who judges people by their character. The incident was not the only strange phenomenon Bert experienced at the Princess. Many employees said they'd seen an inexplicable light in the upper circle, he recalled. I saw it myself several times. It was a yellow object, hovering and fluorescent. Definitely not a globe. I have spoken to several present and former Princess Theatre staff members who believe they too have been touched by the cold breath of the supernatural. Popular wisdom among Princess Theatre staff is that the ghost is the shade of Federici, English tenor Frederick Baker, who visited Melbourne in 1888 to play Mephistopheles in Faust. He had a fatal heart attack after falling through a trapdoor on stage. So maybe it is the ghost of Frederick Baker. Federici. Or maybe these people are in the entertainment industry, so they're prone to think outside the box and be imaginative. Although this hooded figure here in the cemetery does give me chills. You can see that wrought iron fence through it. Oh, this is me talking now, by the way. No longer reading John Pinkney's great book. They're hard books to find. I can find them in secondhand bookshops here and there. I definitely recommend them. And I'll probably talk about a few more in upcoming podcasts. But I really wanted to ask, have you ever seen a ghost? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. Perhaps you could comment down below. If it's really good, I'll read it out in the next podcast. If that's okay. Well, if you're still listening, thanks very much for making it to the end. Woohoo! We're at the end of the first, well, second, Beware of Ghost extras. Beware of ghosts in general, I guess. Ghosts in general, and in sergeant, and in corporal. Any ghosts in the military altogether is my tip. Well, wasn't that interesting? It's a funny old world we live in, full of snow and laneways. Comment below, that'd be great. See you next time. Sitting down a snowy laneway podcast.